Episode 127 of the Interpretation Station is called to order. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Special episode of the Interpretation Station today for my Russian-speaking followers, fans, all you interpreters out there. We're back to some rather grim subject matter. We're back to the situation in the in Ukraine. It's hard to sort of get away from it. This was actually, the episode today is based on a meeting that I was in last week. It was a special session of the Human Rights Council, and the title of it was the special session on the deteriorating situation of human rights in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression. And the texts that I have for you today, we've got two. So we've got the first one we're going to look at is by Belarus. So it's interesting, you may already know that Russia have been expelled from the Human Rights Council. So and they didn't even take part in this meeting. They weren't even there. However, Belarus still took part. They are an observer in the council, and obviously their position is very much pro-Russia. So what they say will echo in many ways what the talking points of the Russians would be anyway. And then to offset that, we also have a statement that was delivered by the Ukrainian High Commissioner for Human Rights. Okay, I think we had something by him was episode 124. It's quite good because obviously the Ukrainians usually speak English in the meetings, the delegation does. But it's good because this High Commissioner, both his statements so far have been in Russian. So it's good to just be able to compare and contrast what the two sides are saying, seeing some of the interesting vocabulary that the Ukrainians use. And so it's a good opportunity, as I say, to balance the two off against each other. So without further ado, let's get down to the text. I'm going to put the link, as usual, to the texts down in the description box, together with the link to the original audio, so you can go and try the statements yourself. Now, I actually did the Belarus one in the meeting. In fact, let's bring it up now on the screen for you. Now, I did have time to prepare it, the Belarus one. There's, as I say, some very interesting vocab in it. What actually happened, if you listen to the audio, is that the speaker sort of didn't stick to the text always. She sort of slipped in a couple of additional items, and it was quite hard to follow on a couple of occasions. She was also speaking quite fast, being able to follow when she was going with the text and when she was coming off it. But anyway, we'll just look at it as the text as it was provided to us. Okay, and let's see what the Belarusians had to say. So here we go then. Mr. President, we have no doubt as to the politically motivated goals of holding the current special session of the Council. This is shown by many things, including the draft resolution planned for consideration, which is imbalanced and subjectively interprets the situation in Ukraine and the actions of the parties to the conflict. So, на это указывает многое. Maybe you could say there's a lot that points to this, or as I say, if you want to follow the syntax, if you're really right behind the speaker, you could say this is shown by many things, this is highlighted by many things. Однобоко интерпретируется, I said, subjectively. Okay, I suppose you could say one-sidedly interprets. Sounds a bit ugly in English, but I suppose you could say it. The actions of for сторон конфликта, if you could just say the parties. I think that is also a legitimate solution. I said the parties to the conflict. We regret that the tragic events in Ukraine have, for a group of Western states, become a bargaining chip in their global geopolitical pretensions. Okay, разменная монета, that's an important metaphor to know. Is it a metaphor? Is it an idiom? Bargaining chip. Okay, you'll hear that a lot. And then this word I thought was quite interesting, притязание. Okay, in their global geopolitical So if you look at притязание in the dictionary, you'll find like in their claims and their demands. I think pretension sounds good. Or I think also in English you could talk about in their global geopolitical designs or ambitions. You can maybe stray a little bit from the exact meaning of the word in this situation to make it sound more natural in English. Often with Russian, I advise you to really stick very meticulously to the original words and have your meanings be very, be very rigorous in getting the meanings of words when going from Russian to English. Here, I think you can maybe you have a little bit more leeway in this expression, because I think in English we talk about in these people's geopolitical, as I say, in their geopolitical ambitions, say, or designs. We note with concern the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Victims include civilians. There's been destruction of social and economic infrastructure. The ongoing practice of detention of civilians against their will in conflict zones. So with обеспокоенностью отмечаем, okay, we note with concern, or we're concerned to note, we're troubled to note, okay, the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I find it easy to put a full stop here, okay, start a new sentence, and then say, the victims include civilians, and throwing in here that there has been destruction of social economic infrastructure, ongoing practice of udержание, good generic word. The best generic word I think here is just detention. Covers all the kinds of forms of detention, whatever it may be, arrest, kidnap. Detention is a good, as I say, a generic word, sort of umbrella word that covers a lot of these concepts, which is what you want when interpreting, when you're not 100% certain of what the specific meaning that the speaker is trying to give. Is always, play safe, get your most generic, versatile word and use it against their will in areas of conflict and conflict zones. We're concerned that the conflict in Ukraine is increasingly turning into a прибыльное дело. So I said here, a lucrative business. Okay, now lucrative, what if lucrative doesn't come to mind immediately? Well, прибыль, the first word that should spring to your mind is that of profit, okay? Now, I like my mnemonics, I like to associate things with the sounds with words. So прибыль, okay, profit, прибыль, profit, okay? So if lucrative wasn't come to mind, then I'd be thinking, okay, profitable business for certain Western states. Now, this is a very tough, generally, sentence and paragraph, которые накачивают его оружием, и прибыль от этого извлекают военные корпорации, приближенные к ним элиты. Now, the Belarusians, actually, I only found this after the meeting, they did actually provide an English version of their text. And for накачивают его оружием, they actually said, they talked about pumping weapons to Ukraine, which would do. I mean, the Russians, they would hear that and they'd be fine if you heard pumping. Although, now, it's a very important concept, this, in the whole Ukraine-Russia conflict, because the West is obviously supplying the Ukrainians with vast amounts of weapons. So you want to have a nice, succinct way of expressing that in English. And the verb that sprang to my mind when I was preparing it was lavishing them. They're lavishing the Ukrainians with weapons. Okay, and the profit from this is being extracted by military corporations and their приближенные к ним элиты, their crony elites. So again, I had the time to prepare this. What would I've done if I hadn't had the time to prepare? I said, the profits are extracted. That's quite a high register word. If it doesn't come to you in the moment, I mean, you just have to go for the more simple option, and the profits are made by, profits are taken by military corporations and the elites close to them. But again, I think this is an important sort of talking point within the sort of Belarusian narrative on the conflict, that basically the Western military corporations are making masses of money out of this, and this is obviously beneficial to their cronies, okay, the elites that they're associated with. So it's good in English to have a couple of these ideas turning over in your head. The crony elites, the idea of who they're cozy with, who their bedfellows are. It's just useful, you might just come into a statement where those words, one of those words might fit nicely. It might nicely paraphrase. Maybe you can't get the exact word for word rendering of whatever they're talking about, and those sorts of words you can draw on them, and you can use and use them to paraphrase the situation. So I just want you to just remember some of those ideas, okay? Cronies, the idea of coziness, bedfellows. Now, business na krovi. Now, here I think I said this gruesome trade. Now, I know in English we've got a couple of expressions. We talk about blood sports. We talk about blood feuds in certain countries. Somehow blood business didn't sound right. The Ukrainians in their version did actually they use blood business. I think if you're going to use blood, maybe this blood trade is maybe better in English. So here you could just play safe and go for blood business, I guess. But yeah, the other options I would give you, this gruesome trade we've already seen in other parts of the world, and it always is accompanied only by victims and human suffering. Okay, today on подливает масло в огонь конфликта в Украине. So you could go for the like for like idiom here. Today it pours oil on the flames of conflict in Ukraine. Or slightly shorter, you could just skip the oil, and you could just say today it's fanning the flames of conflict in Ukraine. This could become a trigger for irreversible challenges in the sphere of regional security, arms control, and countering international terrorism. Again, I've made a new sentence here. Makes it a little bit easier. We must not allow this. We cannot allow this. In that context, Belarus reiterates, I've turned here vnov подчеркивать just into one single English verb, reiterates the need to settle or resolve the conflict in Ukraine at the negotiating table. We urge countries and international institutions, отказаться от, so to abandon, or if you've watched again enough episodes of Interpretation Station, you know that I do like to eschew things. We call them, the institutions, to eschew the mentality of block confrontation, блокового противостояния. And сделать ставку, again, we can just make that into one English verb, and focus on political and diplomatic efforts, and not on supporting war. Belarus is заинтересована, it's interested in, it's eager for the swift скорейшее наступление мира, swift restoration of peace is basically what they're saying. I guess literally word for word, the swift advent of peace. Advent's a very high register, though we usually talk about Advent. Well, we talk about it in the terms of Christmas, don't we? The Advent calendar. But anyway, swift restoration, the swift advent of peace in Ukraine, and is ready, as it was before, to fully facilitate the search for political compromises. So содействовать, I always tend to go with facilitate. The two verbs in Russian, содействовать and способствовать. I do very much like to compartmentalize things in Russian. I do like to generally have like for like words. This was a bit of an exception earlier on when I was talking about притязание. Generally, I like to be very rigorous, as I say, with what English word I use for what Russian word. So with содействовать, I always go with facilitate. With способствовать, I always go with contribute. That's contribute to. That's just how I like to do things. Okay, so that was the Belarusians. Now we're going to look at what the Ukrainian Human Rights Commissioner said in response. Okay, so here we go then. So, ladies and gentlemen, on the 24th of February 2022, Russia launched an unjustified full-scale invasion of all of the territory of our country. Every day, the right to life of Ukrainian citizens is under threat, or is being jeopardized, if you want an alternative to this thing, threatened. Russia, in violation of international humanitarian law, of the Geneva Conventions, and using prohibited or banned weaponry, phosphorus shells, thermobaric munitions, and cluster bombs, is targeting civilian infrastructure. Okay, so a couple of interesting things here. Prohibited weapons, banned weapons. I think you can say either there. Snariadi, my go-to word for snariadi is usually shells. Okay, phosphorus shells. This is a big talking point. You know what these weapons that are being used there. The thermobaric munitions. Now, I think this is a reference in part to. You may recall a few weeks ago there was quite dramatic footage of. I think it was an arms cache somewhere near Kharkov going up in a huge great mushroom cloud. It almost looked like a nuclear explosion, and I think that was using these thermobaric munitions, bombs. I'll put a little picture up there in the corner just so you can visualize a little bit the incident I'm talking about. Kasetnia bombi, that's a very important expression to know. In the kasetnia is cluster munitions. On, I think, mirnim obiektom, okay, maybe literally peaceful facilities. I think it basically means civilian facilities. It's impossible to count the victims. Active hostilities are underway. Боевые действия, I would usually go with hostilities. I guess you could say active fighting, simply. In the liberated territories, our citizens have been buried, shot dead at point blank range. So I think the idea here is that, you know, what these territories that the Ukrainians have recovered, Zakharanenie, I think there may be a connotation of they've been very hurriedly buried, maybe buried in shallow graves. Presumably, a lot of them have just been buried there where they fell on the spot. There's not really the time, there's not really the opportunity to conduct a proper burial ceremony. I mean, I think here in English you could just say that, you know, our citizens have been buried, but I think that's the connotation, that the idea that it's without any ceremony, it's just sort of been buried in shallow graves. Прицельный выстрел. I mean, so I looked this up. It was what I thought it was. So shot at point blank range. That is what we say in English. Thousands of citizens have perished during bombings and under the ruins or under the rubble of destroyed buildings. I mean, okay. Yeah, you probably want лишили жизнь. That's quite a high register way of saying that in English, isn't it? Thousands have perished, have been slain, were slain during bombings under the zavalami, as I say, rubble, ruins. If that high register word again isn't coming to you in the moment, then you just got to play safe and just say were killed during bombings. Russian servicemen, военнослужащие, I mean, that's the like for like rendering, have committed sexual violence in the occupied territories with particular brutality, жестокость, cruelty, brutality, publicly, in the presence of, in front of the families of the victims, in front of children, mothers. So yeah, as I said, it's pretty grim stuff, some of this. Here's an interesting word, rashisti. Now, I think initially I thought this was a misprint. I thought it was maybe saying rasisti, but then I did remember, I had heard this maybe a few days before the meeting, that this is one of these new words that's being used in the context of the conflict by the Ukrainians. Okay, sort of slang, all this you're getting a lot of new jargon that's being used that you need to actually know what to do with it. Okay, so I mean, this is like a combination of this is Russkie fascisti. They call them rashisti. I don't think it would work as well in English if you were to say the rashists, which would be the equivalent. I don't think people would understand what you're talking about. So you would want to say, I think, just Russian fascists. Okay, the Russian fascists have forcibly taken the residents of occupied territories to so-called filtration camps, or they've expelled the residents of occupied territories, taking them to so-called filtration camps. Citizens are subjected to torture, interrogation, and filtration. So again, this is what they are called, filtration camps. That does seem to be the sort of buzz phrases for these places. Also, yeah, mentioning this jargon that's creeping up in the context of this conflict. Other things that I've come across. I was in a meeting a few weeks ago, and it was the Russians that were speaking this time. And it was in a meeting, I think it was a conference of disarmament, and he was saying how the Ukrainian government, in this period between 2014 2022, he was saying how all these sort of nationalist battalions, they were talking about how they wanted to all go down to the Donbass and kill the Moskali. Okay, so the Moskali is slang for the Russians, for the Ruskies, I guess. Could you say that? I think the Ruskies. I just said the Russians during the meeting. I recognized, I couldn't think exactly how I would render it. Maybe you would say, as I say, the Ruskies. And I know there's another nickname that the Russians use for the Ukrainians, Hachli. It's to do with the hairstyle, the old Ukrainian peasants back in the day that sort of resembled like the crown on a bird's head. Other ones, I know that the Ukrainians call the Russian troops as well, I think the Orki, if I'm not mistaken, like the orcs from the Lord of the Rings, if ever you hear that. And I think I've heard the people in the Donbass call the Ukrainian soldiers, I think, ukropi. That's an expression I've heard a few times. I think it's ukropi. Ukropi. That's a reference to the Ukrainian military by the pro-Russian residents of the Donbass. So just take a note of these. Just while we're at it, again in a meeting just a couple of days ago, I was working, it was actually in the UN Economic Commission for Europe. Okay, nothing to do with the conflict in Ukraine, ostensibly. I was fortunately, it wasn't my half hour, it was my poor colleague who was working, and the Russians spoke, and they used an expression with the word hata. I'd never known this. Hata, I'll put it up on the screen just so you can see. A hata is an old peasant house in Belarus, Ukraine, and southern Russia. And there are a couple of, and the speaker used this expression. The speaker said, "Sgariel sarai, gari I hata." So she was talking about what she was saying the Ukrainians were doing this. And so I think my colleague translated that it's like as a scorched earth policy. I mean, if you look at multitran.ru, it gives you the barn has burned down, so let the house burn too. So I think that was a pretty good attempt actually by my colleague. Said scorched earth policy. And then I know another expression again with hata that apparently is used a lot. Maya hata skraju, which basically means it's nothing to do with me, not my problem, okay? Maya hata skraju. So if, you native English speakers, be aware that that's an expression you might run into. Anyway, let's go on. So the the final paragraph, we urge the member states of the Human Rights Council to take decisive, active steps for the return of Ukrainian citizens deported to Russia. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Okay, so there you have it. Now what I'm going to do is just to slightly replicate booth conditions. I'm going to do two quick site translations of these texts just to see what sort of solutions come to me in the moment. Maybe I'll try and use some new words that I didn't perhaps use before in the episode, and let's just see how I would approach this if I was doing it live. Mr. President, we have no doubt as to the politically motivated goals of holding this special session of the Council. There's a lot that points to this, including the draft resolution planned for consideration, which is imbalanced and which subjectively interprets the situation in Ukraine and the actions of the parties to the conflict. We regret that the tragic events in Ukraine have, for a handful of Western states, become a bargaining chip in their global geopolitical pretensions. We're troubled to note the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine. There have been victims among civilians, destruction of social and economic infrastructure, the ongoing practice of detention of civilians against their will in conflict zones. We are concerned that the conflict in Ukraine is increasingly turning into a lucrative business for a number of Western states who are lavishing Ukraine with weapons. And the profit of this is being extracted by military corporations and their crony elites. This gruesome trade we've already seen in various parts of the world, and it is always accompanied by only victims and human suffering. Today it's fanning the flames of conflict in Ukraine, which could become a trigger for irreversible challenges in the sphere of regional security, arms control, and fighting international terrorism. We must not allow this. In this context, Belarus reiterates the need to settle the conflict in Ukraine at the negotiating table. We urge countries and international institutions to abandon the mentality of bloc confrontation and prioritize political diplomatic efforts and not support war. Belarus is keen for a swift restoration of peace in Ukraine and is ready, as it was before, to fully facilitate the quest for political compromises. Okay, and then the Ukrainians. Ladies and gentlemen, on 24 February 2022, Russia launched an unjustified full-scale invasion of all of the territory of our country. Every day, the right to life of Ukrainian citizens is jeopardized. Russia, violating international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, using prohibited weaponry, phosphorus shells, thermobaric munitions, and cluster munitions, is targeting civilian facilities. It's impossible to count the victims today. Active hostilities are underway. In the liberated territories, our citizens have been buried, having been shot at point-blank range. Shot dead at point-blank range. Thousands of citizens have perished during bombings and under the ruins of destroyed buildings. Russian servicemen are committing sexual violence in their occupied territories with particular cruelty publicly in front of the families of the victims and children and mothers. The Russian fascists are forcibly evacuating residents from the occupied territories, taking them to so-called filtration camps. Civilians are undergoing torture, interrogation, filtration. I urge the member states of the Human Rights Council to take decisive, active steps for the return of Ukrainian citizens deported to Russia. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Okay, so there you have it. That should give you a few ideas, and then hopefully that's given you a few ideas to how to tackle a text like that. Hopefully you've learned a few new expressions, new idioms. Guys, if you have learned something new from this episode, I'd kindly ask you to give me a like, share, and subscribe. in the comments. Let me know if you have specifically learned some new words, or if there's anything that you would have done better than me, maybe in rendering this text. Any ideas you have in terms of vocabulary that would improve, that would be an improvement on how I did it. Please do let me know, as I say, in the comments under the video. As I say, the links to the text, to the transcripts, and to the audio can all be found there in the description box. And that's pretty much all for today. So with that, all I'm going to say now is that episode 127 of the Interpretation Station stands adjourned.
The train is now leaving the Interpretation Station. We hope you enjoyed your visit. Until next time, folks.